Oh, and good evening. It's December 17th, 2024, and we're continuing our discussion collection in the Outside the Class series. This series from the Bible Project covers the entire TaNaK, right? The Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com and the Outside the Class section, all of those source videos are set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to that in-class lecture first. All those lectures can be found in the source video playlist because we want to try to keep these to about 15 minutes. We want to make them easy to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and maybe different twist on Outside the Class. On the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, you can click that subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So in this series, right, we're going to cover the entire TaNaK, the Old Testament, in the original order of the collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So as we get past these first 5, we're ending it today, it could get interesting. Because remember, the videos we discuss, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They're part of a learning series that I highly recommend, and they can all be found on the Bible Project website. Because we're going to ask a lot of questions about all kinds of things. Answers? We'll see. Deuteronomy, Devarim. This is our part 4, the last one. Because I think we're going to have some fun here. We're going to discuss the reading tips that Tim covers at the very end. I like his approach, and there are some parts that I think maybe we need to examine, others that maybe we need to reconsider differently. So the first one states that the laws are the covenant terms given to ancient Israel at Sinai. I agree, 100%. The details in these instructions must be within a context of the framework where they were designed to be in the time frame, in the environment of those situations. But the relevance, importance, the wisdom of these, they extend far beyond the situational position of an original law. So I want to use a tiny example just to give us some setup. In Somerville, South Carolina, a law still on the books says you can't tie your horse up in front of the courthouse. And that law was very applicable in its day, and it had a purpose. You can discuss amongst yourselves why you think that law would have been in place at that time. But since nowadays, most people don't ride their horses up and down the street, even in peace, so that law becomes more about the reason behind the law. Does that make sense? I mean, this is what I'm talking about. In other words, it was necessary and it had context. The law, it had purpose. But does that same purpose need to be addressed later? And if it does, can it look different? But in that difference, right, we need to try to do the same purpose if we can, and we have to make sure that that doesn't also challenge another one of God's instructions, and that's work. It can be harder for us, right? It's getting more complicated for us. It's more challenging because now we have to do a little digging. We ask, we seek, we knock. Because I think there's even more to bear in this. As Tim said, there's no real comparisons between these and modern laws akin to that tied up horse in front of the courthouse. Since I don't have a horse, that doesn't mean that this doesn't mean anything to me. But maybe I should ask, is there something that I need to change or something I need to address? Do I need to address things? Maybe look at them differently. And again, look at us in our current time, in our current context. Something to think about. So in the second part, right, he compares the laws in those other places. And that's interesting because where I'm at today, when I look at things the way I do, like I mentioned several times, my wife and I like to watch foreign murder, mystery, intrigue, suspense shows. Yeah. So all these foreign cultures, they have differences in how they approach their laws, right? The legal structure, what police can do, and maybe the different titles we use. What we call a judge in America will have that same exact word used in the English translation subtitles, but the role differs from what we have in our judicial system. So when you see them, you see good, right? You see some challenges, but it's interesting to watch them play out, to see how that fits in that society. It's fascinating. It really is. And I'm not here to say that America's legal system is better than any other country's legal system. It's merely to say that there are very much differences. This is part of what these instructions are talking about. Because your approach to life will differ from that of the communities we live in now compared to then. Because back then, these people would have discussed the nations that they were talking about, right? The areas that were surrounding them, how they interacted, where they were, where they had just left Egypt. Yeah. It's interesting because if we had that horse in front of the courthouse, if that was part of this instruction, that would be at that time. So what was going on in other places? Say camels. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I think it is essential to consider these as Tim puts it. So in Tim's last part, which I liked, he said to try and discern the core principle underlying the law, the wisdom wrapped up inside it. So if you want to look, that's one of the big questions. You know, I hope to one day do a series on the laws, and I want to break them down individually because I think they're fine. It's just going to be challenging because some of them are directed towards some things that don't exist today. Say, for instance, priesthood. As far as what its duties were inside that priesthood, right inside the land, the right things that they had to do as priests in the nation of Israel, in the land of Israel, those don't exist anymore. However, if we say that we use the term that we're now priests for Jesus, we like to say things, but we don't look at the wisdom or the purpose behind that. And if we looked at these instructions and what priests were part of and the instructions that we needed to review, I think we would see things that maybe we wouldn't expect. So Tim had this little extra credit assignment that we can briefly peek at. I'm confident that probably most have never taken serious peek and they try to compare these. Remember, because we're not talking about a single verse, we don't just pull out the verse and then we go, yeah, the two verses are there. It's obvious. I think the real question is, pourquoi? Why? So here are the two verses in context. We have Deuteronomy 25. This is verses 1 through 4. If there's a dispute between men and they go to court and the judge decides their case and they justify the righteous and they condemn the wicked, and then it shall be that if the wicked man deserves to be beaten, the judge will then make him lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of stripes according to his guilt. He may beat him 40 times, but no more, so that he does not beat him with many more stripes. And your brother is not degraded in your eyes. You shall not muzzle an ox while he is threshing. So then we get to 1 Corinthians 9. I'm going to go 1 through 10. This is Paul talking. He says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If to others, am I not an apostle? At least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this. Do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas, that would be Peter? Or do only Barnabas and I not have a right to refrain from working? Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? I'm not speaking of these things according to the human judgment, am I? Right? Or does not the law also say these things? For it's written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. I mean, God's not concerned about the oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it is written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. And I think you want to go really read that whole chapter more because it lays out some really good stuff. But Paul not only sees the connection, but he deems it necessary enough to make the connection. Seems kind of odd to use an instruction that's done away with. I think there's more to ponder, I suppose. Maybe. How do we use it today? So in that last section, we get to Moses' final speech, saying, listening, obeying equals blessing. Rebellion equals devastation, exile. Tim used a phrase that was interesting to me. Thought about it a lot. Forcing them to decide. Okay, wait a minute. This just hit me on it. Is he forcing them? Or is he saying this is what it is, right? It's not a force. It's the choice. It is what it is. If you follow this God, Yod He Vav He, then these are your choices. He's saying follow this God, and why you would want to. And if you say you're going to follow him and you don't, this is what's going to happen to you. So is it an ultimatum or is it a plea? Is it a demand or is it an implore? Moses concludes this with his heartfelt statement, though, right? He says, today I sit before you. I give you life or death, blessing or curse, goodness or evil. Choose life by loving and listening to the Lord your God. So when the storyteller's looking back, and Deuteronomy is the plea, right? The second law where he's given to the second group of these people, right? Because next is a big word here. You might want to avoid repeating those same mistakes, yeah? Because remember, we're reading it from the point of view that these people are looking back on what that is. They're looking back on that storyteller, right? It's kind of that story about a story about a story, right? It's because it kind of rolls back. Because I like how Tim put it, where Moses is telling them, he knows. But one day, wherever you're at, them, and you're at this point, like I said in the storyteller's point, we're looking back. But you're in that moment, having read the backstory, wherever you're at. We've talked about circumcision, that it did start with Abraham. Maybe we should go back there and look at that for sure. Because as we watch it unfold until we get to here, you realized that it really wasn't as much about the foreskin as much as it was about the heart, right? Was the foreskin important? Yes, definitely. Especially at that time. He had them do it again just before they went back in, right? But it didn't do any good to do something if your heart didn't change. It didn't do any good to do something, to say something, from a plea, to a commitment, to a prayer, right? Take your choice. It doesn't do any good to say something without doing it. And that circumcision of the heart will take our actions and we're going to have them align with what? With God's will on earth. Seems Jesus talked about this very same thing on the Sermon on the Mount. Guess I'm not surprised. At the end, Tim brings up something that I'm going to say, I've said it many times here, because this is not a damning statement. I think this is a mirroring statement. It is a statement, but this is ours. This is me. So take that. Say, if we're going to be these followers of Yod He Vav He, if we follow God, now we follow the Messiah. If we're with this group, our hearts need to change too. So when we get to that lovely part in the end where we have the poem of Moses, right? The poems, yeah, where he has the warning poem, then he has the blessing poem, and he tries to wrap up this because at that point, Moses is there. He knows he doesn't get to take them any further. These are the last words they're going to get from him. I mean, he loves these children so very much. He's been involved with them for 40 years. Has he been frustrated with them? Has he been annoyed by them? But he loves them so deeply. He says his final words, and he dies on the mountain. God takes care of him. And it ends. He wraps up with these unresolved questions that Tim mentions. And there's these 4, right? I think there's more than this. But he brings up these 4 major points that I think are very worthy. 1, when will this descendant of the woman come to defeat evil? That's all the way back in Genesis 3. How is God going to rescue the world of Abraham's family through Abraham's family from Genesis 12? 3rd, how can a holy God be reconciled to a rebellious people? Well, that's all over Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And how will God transform the hearts of these people as they end Deuteronomy? I love how we get to ask these questions, right? And then I think I hear a Paul Harvey point, and now you know the rest of the story. Because the rest of the story is going to be living out those 4 points. And that's where I think there's more. I think those are going to be addressed in the scrolls that follow. That's what's going to make this fun, and we're going to have fun as we look at these scrolls at their times, and they will address these issues directly and indirectly. So yes, maybe I need a reminder. Maybe I need to be emboldened so that you can do this. In the land you're going to move to, it's going to be wonderful when you do. Because we've heard the report card of the 40 years trip here, and imagine what ours would look like now. But I think this is why the scroll of Deuteronomy is so essential. It is their reminder. It's our reminder. It's an account of the story to ensure that Moses prepares this group of grown-up children. It reminds them of their forefathers' vow, their commitment to God's accountability for them, and where they need to go from there. I think this was made this look into the scroll of Deuteronomy so fun and so vital, right? Because the purpose of this is different from that of the scrolls before it. I think maybe that's why we get, again, that Genesis chapter 2 deja vu feel here. It's going to continue to be a challenging journey. So, thanks for with us as we've wrapped up the Torah part of the TaNaK on Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet.